When I first got to know the revolutions of 1848, I was a schoolboy in Sydney, Australia, and I must have been 15 or 16 years old. And I remember the teacher explaining to us that these revolutions were complicated and they were a failure. And I remember thinking, that is a very unattractive combination, complexity and failure. And I resolved at that moment never to take an interest in these revolutions again. However, as I did the work for this book, which took many years, but as over the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years, I did the research for this book, I began to see that actually the world of 1848 was not as far away as I had felt it was. And it was certainly not as irrelevant as it had seemed when I read about it at school, when it seemed like something as old as ancient Egypt. On the contrary, the 1848 revolutions are a study very relevant to our contemporary situation, a study of complex conflict, of change without a settled sense of direction. They're a study in moments when politics liquefies, when the plurality of voices becomes disorienting as well as liberating, when politics is hard to predict, when systems are opaque and difficult to read. And that experience of the contemporaries of 1848, the experience of change without clarity, reminds me a lot, or it seems to me at least awakens resonances with our current predicaments. We're currently in a situation where there are many new movements, where movements that people find puzzling, the Trump phenomenon in the United States, the Gilets jaunes, anti-vaccination movements, Occupy Wall Street, QAnon, you name it, and they go on and on and on. The list is very long. And this proliferation of new voices is going hand in hand with a public sphere which is ever more fragmented. There are no national newspapers anymore, no national radio stations. Instead, we have an endless profusion of voices working through a public sphere that is destructured, geared down, localized, no longer disciplined by large, powerful media organizations. So it seemed to me that 1848 had become more, not less relevant. In a curious way, it was coming closer to us rather than pulling away into the past. And those parallels are of great interest, and they make 1848 a really interesting study. It's interesting to think about people maneuvering, trying to navigate their way through a politics of confusion and disruption, having to form affiliations in a situation where there are no clear points of orientation. And that's what struck me as fascinating and relevant about the revolutions of 1848. They're interesting in themselves, of course. History has an intrinsic poetic and human interest if you tell it and imagine it, in a full and deep enough way. But 1848 is special because their revolutions happened at the beginning of modernity, and we now find ourselves, in a sense, at the end of modernity. We're coming to the end of something that they didn't yet know. The world of high industrialization, of breakaway growth, constant growth in population and also in economic outputs. We're coming to the end of the world of the great national television audiences, the national radio audiences, the national newspapers, and in a sense we're returning to a condition which is rather like the condition of 1848. And those resonances, it's not a repetition. History does not repeat itself. But Mark Twain, the American writer, once said, history may not repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And these rhymes between now and 1848 make those revolutions an extremely compelling and interesting subject of contemplation.